So, guys, I want to talk about a disturbing issue that happened during the Demon Slayer movie. That a few days ago was reported that there was this, guy who was, exposing himself and peeing in a movie theater. And then also was more disturbing is that there were young kids actually watching the movie. And this kind of goes into my argument about black fatigue because, one of the things that happens in the black community, but also in other communities as well, is like sexually inappropriate and really just like creepy, inappropriate behavior. And I want to kind of talk about why that's an issue and how that came to be. And I also want to talk about some personal stories. So I remember that there was a guy who was on the West Haven sex offender list, and he was at the bus stop with me, and he was saying like how he was not in a porn. I mean, like how he was at a store that sold porn really, and he was like saying things like, when you gotta jerk off, you gotta jerk off. They don't want me in there because I jerk off a lot. And then he was like whipping out his dick, and he was like saying, I like your neck, boy, and other like things like that. And I didn't shower for a few days, and I actually almost punched my brother in the face because my brother's like 300 or 400 pounds, and he was muscular. So this guy's like jerking himself off in front of me, and my brother's not being a guy who's like, what, I'm gonna deal with this, type of thing. And because I have shitty parents, my dad was kind of like, I don't want to hear things like that. I want to hear nice things that are going on with you. Somebody's jerking off in front of your son, really, you probably want more to know about this, or to file a police report. You don't teach your kids just to let shit like that go, really. Because, again, if we had a daughter, if a father had a daughter, really, he would respond with a bat, or he would respond with violence, really. I've talked about many times how I worked at Southern Connecticut State University. I had a coworker whip out his penis and was like, jerking his penis off a little bit after he peed. So I've definitely experienced both sexual harassment by a lot of black men in my life. And I've also talked about how I had a coworker named Javon at the hospital who was like rubbing my chest and things like that and trying to kiss me. So that goes on a lot in the black community, like this type of creepy behavior. And then there's a couple of things to talk about with this. That number one, we understand the generational trauma of African Americans because of the slavery days. And like back in the slavery days, they say like the whole symbol of the black man grabbing his crotch that came from slavery because back during that time when they whipped slaves, they would try to whip the penis, just because that's the way to hurt. And then also too, a lot of times you watch films like Mandingo, that was very, very true, is that they would examine the penis and be like, okay, that's a black man that we want to have, really, or that's somebody we feel jealous of. So there's always been like this sexual objectification of all black people, especially black men. And I think that just got passed down a couple of generations. You have these people who've gone through sexual trauma, and then they have kids, and they may pass like sexually inappropriate behavior, and that's kind of been passed down, really. But then you look at cultures like Japan, where there's objectification of women. So sometimes women raise their daughters to say, hey, tolerate, the best way to be a housewife is to tolerate, if your husband wants to put their hand in your shirt, you tolerate it. If a man wants to fill up your dress, you tolerate it. So there's always things that are being passed down of inappropriate behavior, or sometimes generational trauma, where it's not saying do this, it's just what's being passed down. The other issue is the lack of fathers, like the men culture. And I think that there's two things that men have to do with their children, not just the boys. Number one is that you teach a boy to stand on business. Like I said, when people were punching the guy in the face and knocking him out, really, and whooping his ass, you teach your boy to do that. If there is a guy who's jerking himself off to your son, really, you need to teach all your kids, you have a right to whoop his ass and detain him until the police come, and send a message that, you don't do this. You don't sex assault people. What would happen if he launched a sperm at me and then it has HIV or whatever? You teach people, you're allowed to give an ass whooping if somebody's sexually assaulting or doing predatory or other creepy shit, really. So we need more father. That's why the father figure is important. That's why, a lot of that is very important nowadays to say, hey, we need to stand on business. We need to be men. Because there's a lot of times that people are not raised to be men. Because my parents raised me to be a beta. And I mean, a lot of like people who are taught that way. They've never people teach about birds and the bees, like, the penis goes in the vagina, sperm happens, and women are taught about their periods in addition to that stuff. But most people are not taught other things about sex, which is, one of the arguments is teaching people to have self-control so that way you're not involved with crazy people when you have sex, like people who lie on you. And then the other part of it is how to handle sexual harassment and how to handle it as a man, really, where like just like in prison, really, somebody's jerking off in front of you, you beat their ass, really, because so we need to bring back some of that talk, really, to say, hey, you know what, somebody's acting creepy, you need to be a man to step in, and that's going to actually motivate other men who to step in and be more alphas, and that's also going to motivate people who have these sexually inappropriate urges to be like, hey, you know what, I'm not going to do that because I know I'm going to get fucking killed where I'm at, really. I'm going to only get fucking killed in prison, so it's going to create a society of that, really. And also too, like I work in a psychiatric ward. I hear stories of children who come in and they've been fucked multiple times by their relatives or gangbanged by their relatives, really. So part of, that's why teaching children to be men, teaching boys to be men is very important, really. And when you don't have the father element, or when you are having people raised by their mothers and you have this beta and feminized men and men not being groomed and trained, really, or you have this culture of entitlement, you're not raising the alpha man, really. And that's been lacking in our society is there's not a lot of alpha men nowadays. And that's not black community, that's in other communities as well. The next thing is we need to just analyze our children. Like sometimes this is tough for me to talk about. I remember when I was a kid, my older brother was 2 years older than me. I was 6, I was 8. He did some, he performed oral sex on me. And my dad just like found out about it because he asked me what was going on, and my dad just threw him into a room and just like yelled at him to say, "Don't ever do that." Really, there's no type of thing of like, "Why'd you do it?" We were adopted out of abuse? Did he say like, "Oh, did your mother do that?" Or where did you learn that? Where did you learn that? Who taught you how to do that? And if he said, then you deal with that. Then if he said something to my brother like, "Oh well, did you like it? What made you come up with that?" And then if you find out that your kid may have a higher sexual drive or sexual energy, you have to say, okay, maybe you might need to teach them how to jerk off. There's a way to do it, or there's a way to show somebody, say, hey, that's a way to release sexual energy, but there might be another better way, because I'm just speaking on spot, really, of you teach your children sexual self-control, and that's one thing that's highly, highly, highly lacking, because you may have children that grow up with a bunch of sexual urges. Like I'll say this, that I remember when I was in middle school and elementary school, when my parents weren't home for 8 or 9 hours, and I was home alone, I'll be streaking through the house, really, because I had a lot of high sexual energy. I remember like one time I wasn't paying attention, and my grandmother came home just to check on me, and she saw me doing that, and then she let it go, really. Even though she should have said, hey, you know what, we need to talk to your dad about this. And then my dad should have a conversation with me saying, like, why you're doing this. And if I said, oh, well, and if it's determined that I have a lot of sexual energy, he'd be like, okay, well, you need to learn self-control over that, and I'm going to teach you self-control. You may need to teach people masturbation to say, hey, this is a way to release the energy. You may need to teach your children there are consequences. Like maybe you have to go to work with my dad for a few months, or hey, you know what, you got to clean the whole house with bleach and whatever, really, because you've been on different places. Or hey, you know what, why you don't do that for a couple of reasons, because what would happen if you're by a window and some pervert's studying you? Or hey, what happens if you have no self-control and you get taken advantage by somebody? Hey, what happens when you become an adult and you have a lot of these sexual impulses and you start to go streaking in public, or you decide to hit on women and other things, and it leads to other things? Like there needs to be more education on sexual self-control, really. Like it's not just, how a woman gets pregnant. It's not just teaching girls about their menstruation. It's teaching boys, you gotta be careful of who you're with, especially women, because women can easily lie about being raped. That's why you gotta be careful of who you're with. That's why you gotta get to know people before you have sex. You also gotta teach your children, if they have a lot of sexual energy, or they have done like some sexual stuff, really, you gotta explore them. Be like, hey, maybe you have a personality that's hypersexual, And we got to work on that because, when you go out in the real world, if you have no training on that, you can end up in a lot of dangerous situations. You can invest in prostitution, you become a prostitute, you can go to San Bernardino, become a porn star, you can make a lot of money, do sex tourism, and go all over the world and have sex with different people for not a lot of money, or go to places like Japan, or there's a few islands in the Americas where the age of consent is very young, really. You can really turn into an issue, or you can form relationships with people just because you want to molest them or whatever, really, or I know this guy who had a situation. I know this guy, and he's friends with this girl who's anorexics, and I've talked to her about this, where he talks about how sometimes when they're web camera, his hand's going up and down, really, and she's not picking up on what he's doing, really, and there's people who have relationships like that, or there's people who are on Instagram or other places where they subscribe to like child models and stuff like that. So it's just like, it creates an environment where if you teach children how to have sexual self-control and that, like I said, call it sexual energy, how to control their sexual energy, that would be definitely like a really, really appropriate thing to do. So I think that's important as well. And I think the other issue is also what happens a lot in the black community is that there's a lot of sexualization of black men, really. Like, have you ever watched the film Coonskin by Ralph Bakshi? Ralph Bakshi, one of the themes about it is what the nigger man is. Like, what is a black man in America? A black man is usually looked at as a nigger. The black man is usually looked at as an athlete or something unwanted, somebody who cannot benefit from the American system unless he's a hustler. And one of the other ideas was also that black men are valued for their dicks, really. And that is a lot of blaxploitation film where black men are always sexualized. That came from slavery and other things. So I think that there's always been a look at black men as hypersexual. So sometimes it's almost like if you are like, well, people sexualize me, how should I respond? It's just like, that's why a lot of young girls talk about being hoes, or there's a lot of girls getting pregnant at a young age, or men that just have no sexual boundaries because they're always taught that part of being a man is to think with your dick, really. Part of being a man is that if there's a white girl and she wants it, you go after it. Part of being a man is you can have no sexual limitation. Part of this is also the pornography culture, because there's a lot of people like me who were born in the 80s, and this is all communities where a lot of old porn films, you would see a man kissing a woman, she'd say stop. You see him, and then he would kiss her more, she says stop again. He fills up her dress, she says stop again. Eventually, he pulls out his dick. She just says stop again. He brushes against her, and then eventually she's getting involved in the act, and then she has sex with him. And the problem with that is that it does teach culture of, okay, well, that's what sex is, really. When a woman says no, you keep advancing in very soft ways, really, until she gives in to the sex. And that's not good because that teaches sexual assault is normal. I had a friend who went to an Asian massage parlor, not friends anymore, really, and he talked about how there was this girl that he paid to get a nude massage from, and he entered her from behind when she bent over, and then after that they were just having sex regularly. And the point of it was, this was in college, like over 10 years ago. I should have said something, but it was one of those things too that I was kind of like really shocked, and I was like, oh fuck, what the fuck is this? We're not friends anymore. But really, he watched a lot of porn, and that's one of the ideas that he got, really, was that, okay, that's how you have sex with women, is that, you do things like say, okay, give me a naked massage. They bend over, then you insert yourself in them when they say no, and then they get into the act and they enjoy it, and then it goes from non-consensual to consensual, from manipulation into consensual gratification, really. So part of it is the porn culture, because a lot of old porn films would have that, and a lot of people grew up on that type of, if you're a male, you just don't have any type of sexual self-control, really. And that's why there needs to be a lot more training on how we have sex with people and how we have control over sexuality, really, because that's a big issue, especially the black community. Especially, because black people have been objectified as seen as sex-crazed people, and there's negative pitching. And then the last part of it is really is really the hip hop culture and the gangster rap culture. Because obviously, with R. Kelly and everything like that, it's an image of a black man not having boundaries, such as peeing on people, child pornography, and other crazy things. And then also too, you look at rap culture, and like, as I said, bitches and hoes. You hear songs like, me so horny, Saka to me so horny, that song. And he's talking about, she can suck my nuts and lick my asshole too. I'm a freak and cheats, me so horny, and other things like that. Like, there's always been this like hypersexual culture as well, really. And like, as I said, that may encourage people to be like, okay, as a black person, I'm going to be hypersexual, 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 hypersexual. So it lands people in jail, really. And then the cycle continues, really. So we also have to teach our children, when you hear that stuff, that's not the way to be, because there's consequences for what you say to people. There's consequences for what you brag about. There's consequences for what you keep in the bedroom with a consensual partner, and there's consequences for doing inappropriate or sexual activity, like peeing in public around people. And then the last part of it is mental illness. I think this is one of the huge things in the black community, especially because in a lot of communities, because I grew up in the 90s, the way it worked was that until like the mid 2000s, or until like 2020, if you had mental illness, you were considered a mental retard. And that was a lot of communities. But also the black community is harder because, again, there's the machismo, there's the sucking it up, there's ignoring of generational trauma, there's also ignoring of sexual generational trauma, which stemmed from the slavery days. But a lot of times but also too, like, a lot of my therapists were either white or Jewish. I never had a black therapist before. There's also people insecure who don't seek black therapists, but a lot of therapists are usually whites or Jews. So what happens to a lot of black people is that they may feel insecure, or like, I saw a therapist for like 10 years and he was Jewish and he was white, and he would say things like, don't become another black man going to jail. When I talk about James Baldwin and Martin Luther King, he would say shit like, I'm glad you have black role models. Like, he was trying to turn me into a token black man. We ended on bad terms, but I remember him saying, I lost all respect for you. But it's like, if I was white, he probably would not say things like that. But the point of it is that there's a lot of times where there's black people who need a lot of mental health help. And I worked in psychiatric wards, and I understand too, they do things sometimes where if a person's homeless and they're talking to themselves, they'll kidnap them, bring them to a hospital, put them on medication, detain them against their will. If they want to escape, they say, hey, you know what, I said no, you're bringing me in against my will, you're judging my safety when I know how to take care of myself. They'll drug them, put them on other medications, and force them to comply. So there's a lot of times in the black community where there's bad experiences around mental illness. There's a lot of white people who are therapists and psychiatrists. There's a lot of white police officers that make the judgment for homeless people and other people on the streets and saying you need mental health help. And there's also that thing too, as well, where a lot of schools, a lot of teachers, and a lot of parents are white, really. Like, I grew up in Guilford. I had mental health issues. And I had issues with trauma and responding to my trauma with antisocial behavior. So I remember in high school, my dad was very verbally and emotionally abusive. I remember teachers saying that I need to be put on medication, or people need to I need to be put on medication. And then nobody listened to my side that dealt with verbal abuse after I did some bad behavior at home and other things like that, really. I remember one time in high school that, there was a speech where people shared what they thought about, share about what was going on with them. And I was really saying that I'm a house Negro. And I was also saying too that I hated having black skin because of the bullying I experienced around being bullied by African Americans through my life, and how my biological mother nearly killed me and my older brother and a couple of my other siblings. And I remember people laughing and finding it funny because I thought that I was like Uncle Ruckus or Dave Chappelle. And I suffered from PTSD. I remember my father called me the N-word a bunch of times to kind of teach me that, you're black, and black people do not, and black people are supposed to, be supportive of black people and other black causes. Blacks are not supposed to be anti-black, really. When I was trying to say, hey, I have a lot of these conflicting thoughts and I want to overcome my thinking. But I remember how my father was verbally abusive. One time I got accused of grabbing my crotch from a teacher, like a gangbanger. And what happened was the night before I stayed up all night, really. But I remember my dad um, listening to another teacher, and another teacher lied and said, "Well, I'm being accused because she thinks I'm black, really." Or they're accusing me because I'm black. My dad was like, fuck you, Byron. When that was the teacher making up a lie. And then one time my dad just grabbed his own crotch from me like, woo, here I'm Byron, this is Byron, really. So because my dad was white, my teachers were white, and everybody was kind of white, really, and my therapist and everything, they were kind of like making assumptions. And a lot of times that happens with black and white relationships. When there's a black person with a mental illness, and they're around a lot of white people, the white people would always be like, hey, I don't want to listen to your side. I don't want to hear your backstory. I don't want to hear where you come from. It's mental illness. Let's put the label on the person. Let's get him medication. And then let's act like he's great and wonderful when we medicate him. And then we'd be like, oh, well, I did this. Way I'm altering his brain, really. So there's a lot of just that in the black community. That's why a lot of people don't get mental health don't get mental health help, because part of it is because it's really, when it comes to African Americans, it's really just to make the white doctors or the white psychiatrists look good, to be like, hey, I turned this crazy nigger into a articulate nigger. There's a lot of those generational traumas and generational racism that happens. And then there's also that thing too of police officers and other people speak on the behalf of people who are mentally ill, and most of the time they do target African Americans or African Americans living in the street. And then also there's that, be tough, be strong culture. But when it comes to black people and mental illness, it goes down to what I've said, really. Like I talked earlier about checking your child's behavior. If your kid is sexually impulsive, I remember going to a summer program, and at the summer program there was people with special needs and stuff like that. And I remember there's this person who said when he was in middle school, he ran around streaking, and one time he was streaking in the street and he got arrested. So he got put on medication. Stuff like that really needs to happen. Or sometimes you may have kids with sexually inappropriate behavior. Maybe hey, maybe it's not just discipline, it's therapy and other things like that, Or you may have children who've had an inappropriate childhood. I remember working in the psychiatric ward, there was a little girl saying that she was molested by her parents and to the doctors, and then another day she's saying she wants to be a stripper or a porn star. So it's kind of what I've said, really, about how there's a lot of times where people are exposed to sex. They may enjoy it because they got stimulated, or, they don't know how to process it. And a lot of times with girls, sometimes it's almost that's their first exposure to men, as being molested by men. And then there's some women who grow up with men touching them all over, or sexual fetishes where men violate them, or treat them like crap, really. So when you have somebody that's been through a lot of trauma, or when you have situations where people have mental health issues, or they have less sexually impulsive behavior, you need to say, hey, they need to talk to therapists, they need to get their lives straight, really. Because when you turn 18, you're going out in the big world and you lose opportunities, and nobody wants to see their child go into jail and be killed for being sexually inappropriate. We got to prevent things now, really. But it is a cycle of, ultimately, trauma. It's a cycle of mental health not being for the interests of black people, and also mental health just being a predominantly very white industry, and also sometimes it's to make money off of people, or it's just to be like, oh, well, hey, I'm a white guy, I'm a doctor, I'm a parent, and I took my black child or my black patient and I medicated them. They're doing well. Thank me for them doing well, really. So, it's a lot of different things, really. So, and then it's also just the failure of fathers and other things like that, teaching their boys how to have sexual self-control and how to stand on business when they see somebody, whipping out their dick and peeing in a movie theater in front of children, really. So there's a lot of things that need to be changed, and I'm happy to just do this video.